Hello, I am Roberta Levin, and I will be discussing writing a literature review with you. This is designed for undergraduate nursing students. This is a basic overview of finding and reviewing research evidence in the literature from Chapter 6 of your textbook. The chapter has 5 learning objectives: to understand the steps involved in doing a literature review, to identify bibliographic aids for reviewing research reports and locate references for a research topic, to understand the process of screening, abstracting, appraising, and organizing research evidence, to evaluate the style, content, and organization of a literature, and finally, as always, you should be able to define all of the new terms in your chapter. Did you ever ask yourself why things are done this way? One of the purposes of your research question is to test measurable relationships examined in a research study. As review, the hypothesis predicts the outcome of a study. So, you have an intelligent hunch that something that is happening with your clients or your patients, or even with the interaction of nurses. And the hypothesis is basically a way that can guide the design, assessment, and interpretation of data that may come from a study you want to do. It's the bridge between the theory and the real world. And in the next chapter, we'll talk more about theory. What about a clinical question? Not all questions are research questions. Some of them are clinical questions, and a clinical question is one that helps you guide your practice. You may want to know what is best at preventing central line infection, or you may not want to know which is the best type of mask on a COVID-19 unit. How do you develop your research question? The first thing is you begin by defining a specific area of interest to you. And the next thing you do is you review the relevant literature. Today, we're going to talk more about reviewing the relevant literature. Let me give you an example. This person was interested in disparities in high-risk populations for HAV and HBV. And the first thing they did was brainstorm. And when you're brainstorming, you ask yourself some questions. How effective is peer coaching and case management involving health outcomes with challenging patient populations? Or how effective would this approach be to males experiencing homelessness and who happen to be on parole? These are some examples of things people go through when they're brainstorming. Of course, there are different ways we might phrase these today than when this was actually done. Then you do a literature review, and your literature review would be about HAV and HBV as preventable public health problems that disproportionately affect people experiencing homelessness. Once you do that, you would think about what your variables would be. When you've identified those variables, they help you to form the basis of your literature review. When you begin a literature review, you are usually doing it to determine what is known and what is not known. This is generally an early step in one's research process. There are some exceptions to this, such as with grounded theory, but I will also suggest to you that you do a literature review first to see what has already been done. And I know that there are some people that do qualitative research that might argue this point, But one of the things busy nurses don't want to do is recreate the wheel if it already exists. A literature review is a written summary of the state of the evidence on a research problem. Anytime you're doing one, if you really want it to be truly excellent, I always recommend that you engage the help of a research librarian. People who spent their entire careers as librarians are trained on how to do research and how to find the best evidence. They are helpful to you, and I do highly recommend you always reach out to them. In most universities, there is one that is dedicated to nursing, so they're well acquainted with the nursing literature. When you don't have a research librarian, it's a good idea to know how to search PubMed and other databases for relevant reviewed literature. If you go to YouTube and searching PubMed like an expert, there will be many videos that will guide you through searching PubMed. And in fact, on our library website, there are guides on how to search PubMed and other databases. The University of Mexico has many resources to teach you how to search for relevant articles, and I have provided the link for you. One of the things you want to do is identify your search criteria to find the relevant studies and systematic reviews. Remember when you were brainstorming? When you were brainstorming and thinking through your ideas, you probably thought of questions you were interested in, some keywords you were interested in, and some variables you were interested in. Those are good ways to start your search. There may be plenty of articles on part of your question, but no articles on another part of your question. That's okay, because it helps you to identify the gaps in the literature, and it might impact the study that you want to do. There are some types of information, and one of the things you want to start with is looking for primary sources. Primary sources are research reports or articles that are written by the researcher that conducted the study. They are not the opinion pieces by somebody else that tells you about somebody's study. And they're not the secondary sources. So secondary sources are descriptions of studies that are prepared by someone else. Literature reviews are considered a secondary source. There are also case reports and clinical opinions. And you want to make sure that you take a look at the case reports and clinical opinions, because they're going to give you some valuable information, and they will also give you the perspective of other clinicians. But they are not considered high-level evidence. Remember our evidence table that we covered a few weeks ago? Case reports and clinical opinions are fairly low-level evidence, but they can guide you. Let's go through the steps in doing a literature review. First, you want to formulate and refine primary and secondary questions. What is it that you want to know? Do you have any sub-questions that will help you with your question? And then you want to define a search strategy. Your search strategy should include identifying key questions, keywords, independent and dependent variables if you are primarily interested in a hypothesis, and you may not find independent and dependent variables if you're interested in more qualitative work. But the type of study you're doing will sometimes devise your search strategy. You want to search for, identify, and retrieve potential primary source materials. And to do that, there are words that you can use that will help you get research such as saying quantitative research or qualitative research, usually will get you research articles. But another thing you want to do to retrieve primary source material is make sure you're using a trusted database like CINAHL or PubMed or Web of Science. Once you've done your search will reveal to you many articles. And the first thing you do when you're looking at your articles is you screen the abstracts, because the searches will pull up some things that are not relevant to your area of interest. You can go ahead and ignore those or delete them. When you come to an abstract that's related to your topic, you want to save that abstract. And you can either save it to a reference management tool, or you can print it for later. You also want to basically make sure that you know for each search the number of references you initially came up with, the number you finally chose to use, and you want to make sure the search terms you use. And you should always keep track of those, because when you start to write your literature review, this is information that you are going to want to include. Once you've printed all the abstracts that you think are relevant, you want to find the full text articles, and you want to read all of those articles. You want to extract from those information about the studies, and one of the best ways to do this is in a table. And the table should include information of interest to you. For the purposes of our class, I provided you a table, and you should use that table to extract information. It will give you the data that you need. You then want to critically appraise the articles. And the book that we've already gone through in previous chapters gives you some tables that guide you how you critically appraise those articles. There are also some links that I've put in your Blackboard site that will give you tools that will help you critically appraise articles. You can use those tools, or you can use the guides in your book. But either way, when you're first learning to read research articles, it helps to have those next to you when you read them, because it lays out all of the items you're checking for to make sure it's a good article. A lot of people believe, well, it's published and it's peer-reviewed, so it must be good. Things slip through all the time that are not well-done studies, and sometimes things slip through that then later must be retracted because there was an error. You want to then analyze and integrate information and search for themes. So when you have many articles for a literature review, one of the things you're looking for is themes in the research studies, specifically themes in how they were done and themes in the findings. When you write your literature review, you will not write about every single article, but you will write about key articles, and you will discuss the themes. And then finally, you prepare your synthesis and your critical summary of the literature. And how detailed your literature review is depends on what you're doing. If the literature review is for a research study you're publishing, then it's going to be shorter because it's upfront explaining the literature that exists. But if the literature review stands alone, then it's going to be much more detailed. Some suggested search engines for nurses are CINAHL, which is very specific to nursing literature. Most of you have probably already used that in the past. Then Medline, which you will find by looking for PubMed, is biomedical research. Some others are Embase, PsycInfo, which obviously is largely about psychological information, Education Research Complete, which focuses more on educational material, Web of Science and Web of Knowledge, which is very broad, and Google Scholar. Google Scholar's a decent source, but I caution you, it has a lot of information in there that's books and opinion pieces and other things that are not primary sources. Use it with caution because I will be looking for primary sources and maybe some literature reviews and systematic reviews. Each of these databases has its strength, and the library provides information to you on how to search each one of them effectively. You want to make sure that you are always documenting your search. So you want to record the search words, the database search, the number of results, and the number of articles that were selected from the review. You might do a search that has 1,000 articles, and you may only want to use 10 of those articles because a lot of them may be not relevant to what you're doing. The other thing is you may get a lot of articles initially because you didn't limit your search. Most searches for research articles in nursing are not going to be more than 10 years at a maximum, and some are only 5 years. Depending on that, you may not use a lot of those articles because they are much older. Then you want to organize the articles selected. And there are two main ways I would suggest you do that. One is by methodology. What research methods did they use? Was it qualitative or quantitative? And then were there specific methods within that? For example, was it a clinical trial or was it a small study at just one facility? And then the other way is by theme. And you will recognize the themes as you start reading through the articles. The critical appraisal of the evidence, you can refer back to tables 3.1 and 3.2 in your textbook. Or you can look at the CASP criteria, which I attached in your Blackboard site. Identify the themes in the literature. So there are 3 things that you may be looking for if you choose to look by themes. First is substantive themes. That is, what is the pattern of the evidence? The next is methodologic themes, which is what methods have been used to address the question. And then the third is the generalizability or transferability themes. So what population does the evidence apply to? And some studies are very narrow in the population that they were addressing. So in the example we saw earlier, which they were looking at HAV, they were only looking at men who were homeless and on parole. That's very narrow. So the generalizability of the study would then be very narrow. In a clinical trial that does not limit by age, it generally has basically a wide diversity and tries to have some equality in gender and in age and in race and ethnicity. And so that would be more generalizable. And then you come to writing the literature review. Generally, a review includes a table of all the articles you've reviewed. And frequently when you're looking at literature reviews, they will separate it out into 2 tables, one for quantitative articles and one for qualitative. You will always look for the author and the year, the sample, the design, and the key findings. And when you're writing your literature review, you will make sure that you discuss these things. The content of the key findings should summarize the key articles in your own words. But it does not need to summarize every article. It's okay to recognize that the table includes a summary of every article. You are going to summarize the one with the key articles, and then any themes that you may see. One of the things you have to be careful about is bias. You want to be unbiased in your work because you want your work to represent the truth. And to do that, you cannot eliminate articles because they say the opposite of what you were hoping to find. Now, ideally, we should go into it with no hopes. We should just go into it with the hope to find out what is true. That being said, a lot of people are very invested in the work they're doing. It is not okay to eliminate articles because they disagree with your hypothesis or because they disagree with the other articles. And then finally, in the end, you want to summarize the evidence. Anytime you're looking at a literature review, and when you are looking at your own before you submit it, you want a critical appraisal of the literature review. And if you look at box 6.1 in your textbook, you will find this information in a lot more detail. But to summarize it, you want to ask yourself these questions. Does the review seem thorough and up to date? One thing you want to make sure of is you included the current literature. While we say don't go back, you probably won't go back more than 10 years. You certainly want to make sure you included the current year. Did the review rely mainly on research reports using primary sources? And remember, primary sources are those sources where the person that did the research is the one that wrote the article or the report about the research. Did the review critically appraise and compare key studies? Was the review well organized? And that is hard for people that are writing their first literature review, but it's a good reason to write out an outline first so that you make sure you're organized and then you follow that outline. Did the review use appropriate language suggesting the tentativeness of prior findings? Is the review, if your review is in the introduction of a new study, did the review support the need for the study? One of the things you hope not to see is someone that put a literature review up front that shows that what they're doing has already been done and that the study is unnecessary. So, did it support the need for the study that's being done? And we might ask ourselves why this is important. But remember, many studies, in fact, most of our studies, involve human subjects. And if you involve human subjects, you don't want to do things with them that are unnecessary and will not reveal new knowledge. If the review was designed to summarize evidence for clinical practice, did it draw appropriate conclusions about practice implications? And this is sad to say, but a lot of people read the research articles and they see what they want to see. And you will see conclusions that do not follow from the studies that were included. And sometimes to figure that out, you actually have to go back and read all the articles in their studies. In closing, I want to give you a few helpful hints about your literature reviews and things you can do to help. One of the things is when you do your initial literature review, if you find another literature review or a systematic review on the topic, look at all the references they use. That's a good starting point. If your search that you did in CINAHL or PubMed is not finding all those articles, then you might want to say, what key terms did they use in those articles? That's the reason I'm not finding them. And that will help you. The other thing is, in any article that you find particularly relevant, also look at their references. Now, you want to be careful because you don't want to go down a rat hole chasing references, but sometimes this helps you get started.